You may or may not have been following this BDS movement. It stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. It's a movement against Israel, which has gathered a bit more steam than it ever used to recently, with more and more academicians signing on. And what the movement is about is trying to isolate Israel and liken them to the apartheid state of South Africa of years ago. And make sure that the people that study and work and represent Technion and Haifa University and Tel Aviv University and all of the great universities of Israel are not welcome in the United States and elsewhere in the world. It's a devastating, I think it's a devastating indictment of Israel for the people that have a pro-propaganda, frankly anti-Semitic agenda in mind. And yesterday, or recently, I should say, I'm not sure it was exactly yesterday, on legalinsurrection.com yesterday, we became aware of a blog post by William Jacobson, who, in a very articulate way, starting to explain to us what's really at stake. And within our listening area, not too far from WFAS, is Poughkeepsie, which houses Vassar College, one of the most elite and prestigious colleges in all of the United States. And fair to say that a fair number of Jews both teach there and go there and certainly have given money there as alums. And yet 38 professors at Vassar College saw fit to sign on to this BDS movement. So I'm very happy that our next guest, Bill Jacobson, has agreed to come on the show and explain exactly what's going on. Mr. Jacobson, hello and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Well, it's really a pleasure. First of all, tell us how you came to know about this movement and write about it on your blog.
Sure. I've been following the BDS movement for several years. It has been active in Europe. There have been some attempts in the U.S. to get it to take hold here, but they've been fairly clumsy and frankly fairly silly, such as boycotting Sabra hummus in university cafeterias, things like that. Or they'll do flash mobs at stores that carry some Israeli products. But it never really caught on here until last year, 2013, when it moved into the academic sphere and various faculty groups began to take up the issue. And so while I did follow it for many years, I really began to pay attention to it last fall, actually last spring, when the first academic group ever in the United States adopted the academic boycott of Israel, and that's a group called the Association for Asian American Studies, a very small group, very few people had heard of, and other than me, nobody really paid attention when they passed this boycott resolution last spring. I believe it was in May, and people kind of dismissed it. As I heard your opening comments, well, that's just a bunch of crazy academics. Who cares about them? It's not going to go anywhere, and of course, it has gone someplace, and I'm happy to talk about that as well.
So this was originally with an Asian American Studies group?
Correct. And what you have to understand is that what has happened in academia is that fairly radical ideologies have taken hold. So whether it's the Asian American Studies Association or Association for Asian American Studies or other, it's not like when you and I went to college where we actually studied what goes on in the countries and things like that. These are they pose themselves as anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist. They view Israel as simply an outpost of Western imperialism and colonialism in the Middle East. So it's an extremely politicized sort of approach that they take. It's something that you and I would not recognize if we had taken those sort of courses, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And now it's spread. And so because people ignored it when it was at this small group, and literally it is a small group, that first vote took place at a conference where only the people who showed up at a particular room at a particular time got to vote on it, and the vote was unanimous, which shows you,
who they were.
What that was all about.
Yes.
But then it went to a bigger organization, and this is what everybody's been focused on and what's now at issue at Vassar, which is called the American Studies Association.
That's the one that I heard of. That's when it first became on my map. Okay.
That's right. And that's when it got on a lot of people's radar. Now, the people who are behind the boycott have been planning these things for years. And those of us who oppose it all of a sudden woke up, in a sense, when it was too late. And what the American Studies Association, now that's a group, depending, their membership numbers are a little unclear there, but let's say they're about 4,000 members. Sometimes they use a higher number, sometimes a lower number. And they proposed this academic boycott of Israel, and I'll explain what that means. And they passed the resolution in December. But only a small percentage of their membership actually voted for it, but most people didn't show up. It's like anything in life.
Sure.
Whoever shows up wins.
That's so true.
And so they had 4,000 members eligible to vote. Only 1,200 even voted. This was an online vote. Any of their members could have voted. Only 1,200 voted, and of the 1,200, 800 voted for it.
So 20% of the membership.
Depending which number you use,
okay.
About 20% of the membership, less than 20%, actually voted for it, but it was enough to pass it. And that was a big deal because now is the first time that a significant size, not by any means the biggest, but a significant-sized academic group had passed the boycott of Israel.
And it's also shocking because it's an academic boycott. In other words, because we are hoping that the people that are teaching our youth are smart. And it's shocking when they're, in my view, when their so-called intelligence is so manipulative and so manipulated, both.
Right. Now, what has happened is that as soon as that resolution passed, literally hundreds, at last count I think it's over 250 university presidents came out and issued statements rejecting the boycott. Some of the statements were quite harsh, some were relatively neutral.
I know John Sexton, I'm an NYU law alumni, he got reamed because his statement was not harsh enough.
That's right, and major academic groups came out against it. The American Association of University Professors, which has 50,000 members.
Oh, that's a huge organization. Okay.
And various university associations came out against it. So, wide pushback. And one of the people who issued a statement was the president of Vassar College. And the statement was not, on the range from very milquetoasty to very harsh. It was much more towards the milquetoasty end. It was neutral, didn't purport to take any position on the Middle East dispute, but took a position consistent with every other university president who stated a position, which is that academic boycotts are destructive to the academic system, and that you don't deal with your disagreements with in the academic field by boycotting each other, and that's the sort of boycott that could spread, and you could even envision people who don't agree with U.S. policy boycotting U.S. universities, and so on and so on. It was a fairly neutral standard, took no position on the Middle East dispute whatsoever, and it got a fairly furious reaction from 39 professors at Vassar.
What do they say?
They issued a letter, and it's on the website of the student newspaper, the Miscellany News. In fact, it's one of their most commented on letters. And if you look at the letter, it's a very harsh letter. I mean, it basically equates Israel to South Africa pretty closely. I mean, it doesn't say Israel is an apartheid state, but it's pretty harsh. And it's right on the merits of the Middle East dispute, talks about, Israel's, what it's inflicted on the Palestinians, a very politicized, very harsh sort of letter. And that, was signed by 39 faculty members. And then what happened at Vassar, and I've written extensively and I've interviewed the professors involved, is that there's a student group. There are two student groups on campus. One is Hillel, that we all know.
Yeah.
Well, students at Vassar voted to make Hillel an open Hillel.
Yeah, what does that mean?
That means that they will welcome people who are anti-Zionist and call for the destruction of Israel and support the boycott movement. It
sounds like shooting yourself in the foot a little, doesn't it?
Exactly. And so and that's against Hillel international policy.
It certainly is. Hillel is a very pro-Zionist organization.
That's right. Well, not at Vassar anymore. And then
Wow.
the second thing that happened is that, and this what really got attention, and this is why I've challenged the professors to a debate, is that there was a spring term study course run by two professors at Vassar. It had to do with water systems and water, ecosystems and things like that. Not a political course at all. But part of their trip involved a trip to Israel and to the West Bank to study the water issues there. In the Middle East, water is always an issue. Well, a group on campus called Students for Justice in Palestine, which is very hostile to Israel, actually picketed the class, urged students to drop it because they should not be traveling to Israel. And then what happened is that the Vassar administration organized an open campus forum to discuss the ethics of whether the class should have been scheduled to go to Israel.
Are you kidding me?
Can you imagine that? And at this forum, they later changed the name of the forum to discuss campus activism more generally. But originally it was to discuss the ethics of traveling to Israel.
Okay, you know what? This is really upsetting me. I'm talking with Bill Jacobson, Legal Insurrection. Is it .com? That's your blog?
.com, yep.
I keep going, but I'm starting to feel my blood boil.
Sure. And then what happened on March 3, there was an open forum on campus. And it turned into, and there's somebody who's very hostile to Israel, anti-Israel actually, called Philip Weiss. He runs a blog called Mondo Weiss, and he wrote that the hostility expressed towards these professors, the vitriol, the mocking and the jeering, was so bad that even he, as somebody who's anti-Israel, was stunned by it. And I spoke to the professors, and they were absolutely stunned by a room full of people hostile to Israel. I spoke with them. I interviewed them at length. They've confirmed that what I've written about it is accurate. They mentioned how when there were Jewish students in the room who were so taken aback by the anti-Israel hostility that when they got up and announced that they were Jewish, they were jeered. And it really shook the campus, and nobody paid attention to it until I started writing about it. And so what you have at Vassar, based upon what people there have told me, is you have a situation where there is no pro-Israel voice on campus. The 39 professors, now they're not the majority of the faculty. They're only 39 out of...
But that's a lot, 39.
It's a lot.
It's a small college, Vassar. Vassar's a college. I mean, it's not NYU.
No, it's a college. So that's probably 20% of the faculty, something like that. But very publicly, and no faculty have publicly pushed back about it.
Isn't that something?
And so the students there who are pro-Israel feel very, very isolated.
I'm sure.
A group of parents, alums, and other concerned people formed, calling themselves Fairness to Israel, and they've been writing letters and trying to deal with the situation. But what I decided, because I've been studying this issue, I've given a lot of speeches on the BDS movement, and you're right, it is a movement which tries to portray Israel as the new South Africa. And I said, you know what? These 39 professors should have to defend what they've written about Israel. They should have to defend their position. There's nobody on campus who's doing that. I mean, Hillel is gone because it's now an open Hillel welcome to anti-Zionists. The students, you can't expect the students to take on the professors. I mean, these are the people who grade them.
Absolutely.
And there don't seem to be any professors on campus speaking out. By contrast, at Trinity College, when 21 professors wrote a similar letter, 39 professors, I think it was, or 29, whatever it was, but double the number, wrote, a pushback.
So and that's Trinity College in Hartford.
Yes, there was a balance on campus. You had some professors one way, some the other way, but that didn't seem to be taking place at Vassar. So what I've done, and it's going to take place on May 5th at Vassar, 7 p.m., I have challenged those 39 professors, any or all of them, to debate me on the subject of
Mr. Jacobson, stay right there. We got a couple of messages. We're talking with Bill Jacobson about his fight to remedy the inequities in Vassar College, a debate that he has asked for. We'll leave the number open in case you have a question for Mr. Jacobson, 914-693-5700. But we're going to get to what the essence of the BDS movement is, these economic sanctions and boycotts against Israel. Stay with us.
WFAS 1230.
Your turn to call Lisa Wexler on AM 1230 WFAS. Dial 914-693-5700.
Welcome back to Bill Jacobson. We're talking about the BDS movement. Mr. Jacobson, first of all, what is this movement about? Boycott, divest, sanctions of Israel. What do they want to do here?
Sure. You have to understand the history of the boycott movement. Boycotts in the Middle East go back decades before there even was a state of Israel. The first boycotts that I've actually seen documented from newspaper clippings were against Jews in the 1920s in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine. There were boycotts throughout the 20s and 30s of Jewish businesses in what was then Palestine. The Arab League boycott, the Arab country boycott, actually started in 1945, before Israel even existed as a state, and it was a boycott of Jews, essentially. The current boycott system arose out of the Durban conference that took place in South Africa in 2001, which was so anti-Semitic that the U.S. walked out on it.
I remember that. That was a horrible, horrible thing. Yes.
That's right. The late Congressman Tom Lantos, who was a Holocaust survivor, wrote extensively about the caricatures of Jews that were passed around at the meeting. And that's where they came up with this BDS movement. That's where they came up with the idea that they would portray Israel as the new South Africa, and they would seek a sanctions plan against Israel similar to what was implemented against South Africa. And it took 2 or 3 years till they formed it, and that is what is the BDS movement. It's the complete economic, cultural, and academic boycott of Israel. And that's what you're seeing. It's taken a few years for them to get it off the ground, but it is a movement that does not recognize the state of Israel as a Jewish state. It does not recognize, it says it wants Israel to leave all occupied territories, but it doesn't describe what they consider occupied, and they consider Tel Aviv occupied territory. It is a movement which seeks to deny Jewish people their national rights in the Jewish homeland, and that's what you're seeing now. Now, a lot of them like to soft pedal it. And it is true that a lot of the people who support it, particularly in the U.S., would never think of themselves as being anti-Semitic. But the movement they have joined has its roots in anti-Semitic Durban Conference, and it has its roots in a rejection of a Jewish national presence.
It's pretty obvious when you don't want professors to come from some of the brightest universities on the planet, Hebrew University, Technion, and you're saying we don't want to hear what you have to say, that there's another agenda in mind. Because any academician who is honest and fair will always want to hear the newest in knowledge and discovery, and there's so much of that going on in Israel right now.
Sure. Well, the way that they're boycott, they've tried to play it cute. They say they don't boycott individuals, they only boycott universities.
Oh, come on.
Who runs universities?
Oh, come on.
Individuals do. Okay, and what they do is they say, well, if an Israeli academic came here, we would talk to that person as long as they were not here on behalf of their university. So they've tried to play it cute that way.
That's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
It's
laughable.
one step away from saying if you have a Jewish last name, we don't want you.
Well, I mean, they say it's more national origin discrimination than anything. If you're from Israel,
right.
You could come here from Iran, and you could walk into the American Studies Association conference, and they won't ask you if you're here on behalf of Tehran University.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're an Israeli and you show up, they'll ask you, are you here on behalf or as a representative of Tel Aviv University?
All right,
Mr.
Jacobson, I'm going to have to wrap it up, but what I'd like you to do is, if you would